long time to come. And today we are very fortunate to have amongst us as the speaker for today, Professor Francesca Orsini. So I extend a very warm welcome to you, Francesca. जनाब अशोक वाजपेयी जी जो हमारे बहुत ही मोहतरम और बहुत बड़ी शख्सियत हैं, उनका वो चेयर करेंगे आज के सेशन को। उनका भी मैं बहुत दिल से है मतलब करती हूँ। और इसके अलावा आज हम लोग मैं शमसूर रहमान फारूकी साहब की छोटी बेटी हूँ, मैं बारा नाम है मेरा, बारा फारूकी। तो उनकी एक पर्शियन वर्सेस जो उनकी पसंदीदा वर्सेस थे, जस्ट ऑड कलेक्शन ऑफ हिज favorite verses in Persian. He had translated and it had been published earlier by Rupa, and the title of the book was The Shadow of a Bird in Flight. So, in a way, it's a phrase which describes the act of translation. It's the shadow of a bird which is flying constantly. So how do you capture that shadow? So then the book had long been out of print, and when my father fell ill and unfortunately we lost him in December 2020. This book was supposed to be coming out any moment, any time, any month, but we were not. It was stalled because of COVID and all that ensued after that. So finally, we have been lucky enough to get the book out on time with the good officers of Penguin Random House, and we are very grateful to them. I think Mahmood is present here. He will do all the orders of thanking the publishers and all those who helped us in getting the book out. So we have a new edition of The Shadow of a Bird in Flight with us, which will be, formally kind of a book launch. So with regard to that, I don't know who all I'm supposed to welcome, so Mahmood probably knows. तो और एक किताब और है फैज़ मानी, वो अभी छपी है आशिया पब्लिकेशंस के थ्रू। वो भी बिल्कुल नई किताब है, वो भी फारूकी साहब की ज़िंदगी में उन्होंने खुद कमीशन कर दी थी अपने एक तालिब इल्म उसको कहेंगे, हालांकि वो उस्ताद है, सुहेब नाम है उसका, मोहम्मद सुहेब, वो आ नहीं पाए यहाँ पे, इलाहाबाद में है इसका। तो उसमें आप समझ लीजिए कोई 850 से भी ज़्यादा तबसरे हैं, बुक रिव्यूज़। So this book, Faiz Mani, contains about 850 book reviews written by Shamsur Rahman Faruqi during his lifetime in Urdu. So every review that he has written in Urdu is collected here. So you can imagine that literally it's a kind of a history of Urdu literature beginning from the late 1960s and continuing till the 2000s. So उस किताब को भी हम लोग बहुत खुश हैं कि वो मंजर-ए-आम पे फाइनली उनके गुजर जाने के तकरीबन 4 साल बाद वो just seen the light of day। किसी वजह से वो जैसे रुक गई थी। जैसा कि आपको मालूम ही है कि उर्दू पब्लिशिंग इंडस्ट्री जो है वो बहुत सारी हिकअप्स के साथ ही चलती है आगे, लेकिन खैर बहुत अच्छी और खूबसूरत किताब आ गई है सामने। तो उसका भी हम खास करेंगे अशोक वाजपेयी जी से और फ्रांचेस्का से, और भी कुछ जिन लोगों को भी बुलाना पसंद है, जो भी हैं जो इसके हकदार हैं, ज़रूर सभी लोग मिलकर के हम लोग आज किताब को भी लॉन्च करेंगे। महमूद अब आप आ जाएं, शुक्रिया।
So here it is. For this one as well.
आप बोलिए फिर। 850 बुक रिव्यूज हैं। 730 मजमून तबसरे 730 तबसरे शबखून में उनके अपने जर्नल में छपे हैं 730। तो आप सोच सकते हैं क्या प्रोलिफिक तबसरा निकाल थे वो।
थैंक यू वेरी मच। खैर मख्तम है, बहुत शुक्रगुजार हैं हम अशोक जी की, जिनकी सरपरस्ती हमें हमेशा हासिल रहती है। वो पिछले साल भी जब अरविंद कृष्ण मेहरोत्रा साहब ने लेक्चर दिया था तो अशोक जी मौजूद थे हमारी हौसला अफजाई करने के लिए, और आज भी मौजूद हैं। और अशोक वाजपेयी साहब का तारुफ़ कराने के लिए मेरा ख़्याल है कोई ऐसा हो जो उसके बराबर उनके तारुफ़ करा सके तो कराए। तो मैं जो है वो ख़ुद जिसको कहते हैं अज़हर मिनश शम्स हैं इस शहर में, तो आप सब उनको जानते हैं। हमें बहुत खुशी है कि फ्रांचेस्का इस साल का शमसुर रहमान फ़ारूक़ी मेमोरियल लेक्चर दे रही हैं। प्रोफेसर फ्रांचेस्का ओर्सिनी, इलाहाबाद से उनका दैरीना ताल्लुक़ रहा है, फ़ारूक़ी साहब से उनकी मुलाकातें रही हैं। मैं उनसे पहली दफ़ा 1999 में मिला था जब वो कैम्ब्रिज में पढ़ाने आई थी और मैं वहाँ एमफिल करने गया था। और उनका उस वक्त उन्होंने मुझे उस वक्त से कहा था कि अच्छा आपकी नाटकों में दिलचस्पी है तो आप ज़रा भारतेंदु हरिश्चंद्र के नाटक दोबारा पढ़िए। तो मैंने, जैसे होता है जदीद थिएटर वाले जो पुराने लोगों को खातिर में नहीं लाते हैं, मैंने कहा अरे वो तो बहुत पुराने हो गए। उन्होंने कहा नहीं, आप दोबारा उनको ज़रा पढ़ के देखिए और ज़बान का इस्तेमाल देखिए कि किस तरह उन्होंने ज़बान का जो है क्रिएटिव इस्तेमाल किया है, कई जगह उर्दू हिंदी को कैसे मिलाया है, कैसे तोड़ा है। तो उस ज़माने की बात है कि जब मैं मतलब तिफले मकतब था तब से इनकी इतनी गहरी नज़र थी। और मुझसे मिलना क्या था कि फिर तो इनके पर लग गए इनकी स्कॉलरशिप के क्योंकि कैम्ब्रिज से मेरे निकलने के बाद से मैं आवारा घूमता रहा और फिर ये काम पे काम करती गई। और मेरा ख़्याल है 20-25 साल में इन्होंने इतना काम किया है जिसको करने के लिए शायद 50-60 साल की स्कॉलरशिप चाहिए। और फ़ारूक़ी साहब ख़ुद बहुत इंडस्ट्रियस और प्रोलिफिक थे, तो इस मामले में भी बहुत मौजू है कि फ्रांचेस्का ये लेक्चर दे रही हैं। ये बहुत चंद स्कॉलर्स में से हैं हमारे अदब के जिनकी बैक वक्त मिडीवल अदब पे और मॉडर्न अदब पे यकसा निगाह है। मैं बहुत कम लोगों को जानता हूँ जो एक साथ मलिक मोहम्मद जायसी पे और अब्दुल वाहिद बिलग्रामी की हक़ाइक़ हिंदी पे, फ़ारसी में किताब है, और जदीद हिंदी अदब में जिसमें शिव मूर्ति जी तक शामिल हैं और उसके बाद के लोग भी शामिल हैं, उस पर इतनी बराबर की नज़र रखना ये बहुत कम लोगों को हासिल होता है। तो हिंदी लोग जानते हैं, उर्दू और हिंदी भी जानते हैं लोग, उर्दू और हिंदी और अवधी भी लोग जानते हैं, उर्दू और हिंदी और फ़ारसी भी लोग जानते हैं, लेकिन उर्दू और हिंदी और फ़ारसी और अवधी और ब्रज, ये सारी चीज़ें एक साथ जानना ऐसे बहुत कम लोग हुए हैं मेरी नज़र में। और जानना एक बात है, जानने के साथ साथ उसके बाद उस पर बरतना, उसको लिखना, उस पर चीज़ें लगातार करते जाना, बहुत कमाल की चीज़ें हैं। मैं 2-4 इनकी तसानीफ़ का ज़िक्र कर देता हूँ। इनकी किताब, जो इनकी सबसे पहली किताब थी हिंदी पब्लिक स्फेयर पे, उसका पूरा टाइटल मैं नहीं दे रहा हूँ अभी, 2002 में पहली बार छपी थी, फिर 2009 में उसका दूसरा एडिशन आया। और 1920 से लेके 1940 तक जो मॉडर्न हिंदी का पब्लिक स्फेयर बन रहा था, उसमें किस तरह के आइडियोलॉजिकल अंडरकरेंट्स थे, किस तरह का लिटरेचर लिखा गया, किस तरह की आइडेंटिटी, सिटीज़नशिप और नेशनलिज्म और किस तरह के उसमें थ्रस्ट थे, उस पर उनकी ये किताब थी जो बहुत कामयाब हुई। इतनी कामयाब हुई कि उसका दूसरा एडिशन 2009 में छपा। प्रेमचंद पे बहुत ही अथॉरिटेटिव काम ऑक्सफोर्ड यूनिवर्सिटी प्रेस से इन्होंने छापा। उसके बाद वाकई पर लगे इनकी स्कॉलरशिप को। उसके बाद से ख़ास तौर से जो किताबें इन्होंने एडिट की हैं, 2006 में इन्होंने लव इन साउथ एशिया अ कल्चरल हिस्ट्री, जो बहुत ही कमाल की किताब है, इश्क़ और मोहब्बत में, हमारे अदब में, कई सौ साल के अदब में प्रेम के बारे में और लव के बारे में और इश्क़ के बारे में, मोहब्बत के बारे में जो कुछ लिखा गया है, उसका बहुत कुछ का उन्होंने अहाता किया है। 2009 में इनकी किताब आई थी प्रिंट एंड प्लेजर, पॉपुलर लिटरेचर एंड एंटरटेनिंग फिक्शंस इन कॉलोनियल नॉर्थ इंडिया। ख़ास तौर से जब प्रिंट हिंदुस्तान में आया 1800 के बाद से और 1830-40 के बाद से, जब प्रिंट बहुत तेज़ी से हिंदुस्तान में फैला, उसके बाद किस तरह की किताबें छपीं, उस प्रिंट ने हमारे लिटरेचर पे, हमारी रीडिंग पे, हमारी रीडिंग हैबिट्स पे किस तरह का असर डाला, उस पे भी बड़ी पाथ ब्रेकिंग किताब थी ये। 2009 में 2010 में बहुत अच्छा कलेक्शन इनका आया था, बिफोर द डिवाइड। ये भी एक एडिटेड किताब थी, हिंदी एंड उर्दू लिटरेरी कल्चर, यानी 18वीं सदी तक एक जो मुश्तरका ज़बान थी वो अलग अलग हुई, तो उस डिवाइड के पहले वो ज़बान किस तरह की थी, और उसमें बड़े काम की चीज़ें हैं। उस कलेक्शन से मैंने अपनी दास्तान गोई के लिए बहुत सी चीज़ें उठाई हैं, निकाली हैं, क्योंकि हम मानते हैं कि हिकमत को एक गुमशुदा लाल समझो, जहाँ पाओ अपना उसे माल समझो। तो उसमें एक म्यूज़िक पे बड़ा अच्छा पीस था, तो उसमें उन्होंने म्यूज़िक में किस तरह के बोल इस्तेमाल किए जा रहे थे, तो उसमें से मैंने शिव जी का एक भजन था कि महादेव देवन पते पार्वती पते ईश्वरेश नीलकंठ पंचानन दुख हरन, महादेव जटाजूट महादेव गंगा शिखर सुख करण। तो वो उस किताब से मैंने लगाया है, और चौबोली के शोज़ में हम लोग कोई 500 बार उसको 500 शोज़ में उसको इस्तेमाल कर चुके हैं। तो आपका शुक्रिया, मैं आपको जो है वो एक्नॉलेज कर लेना पड़ेगा मुझे। इनकी किताब 2014 में आई, आफ्टर तिमूर लेफ्ट, ये भी कलेक्टेड एडिशन है समीरा शेख के साथ, कल्चर एंड सर्कुलेशन इन 15th सेंचुरी नॉर्थ इंडिया। तो तैमूर के हिंदुस्तान पे मिडीवल इंडिया को सिर्फ मिडीवल इंडिया कह देने से बात बनती नहीं है। मिडीवल तो कोई कैटेगरी एज सच है नहीं, वो यूरोपियन स्टडीज़ ने या यूरोपियन स्कॉलरशिप ने, हिस्टोरियोग्राफी ने एंशिएंट मिडीवल मॉडर्न की कैटेगरीज निकाली, और उनको हमने होलसेल इंडियन हिस्ट्री पे अप्लाई किया, जिनसे बहुत ज़्यादा बातें खुलती नहीं हैं। तो उस कैटेगरी को खोलने में ये एक कदम था कि ये क्या अहद था। उस अहद में ख़ास तौर से तैमूर के हमले के बाद से, जब ये एक तरह का डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन हमारे यहाँ आया, उस डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन ने किस तरह का असर डाला हमारे यहाँ। उसके बाद तैमूर के जाने के बाद जौनपुर में शर्क़ी बादशाहत बनी, बहमनी किंगडम्स बनी, दक्कन में, नॉर्थ में अलग अलग। तो ये छितरने फितरने से एक तरह से देखा जाए तो एक, फॉर वांट ऑफ अ बेटर वर्ड, एक इंडिजनाइजेशन होता है, ख़ास तौर से म्यूज़िक का और इन शायरी का। फिर 2000 नहीं, मैं इनका भाई इनकी ये लिस्ट या तारुफ, इनका तारुफ तो कराना ज़रूरी है ना। अभी तो मैं बस 2015 तक पहुंचा हूँ। और टेलिंग्स एंड टेक्स्ट, म्यूज़िक, लिटरेचर एंड परफॉर्मेंस इन नॉर्थ इंडिया, ये बहुत अहम किताब थी। अब आपने मुझे रोका है, टोका है, तो मुझे उसको जो है वो फॉलो करना पड़ेगा। बहरहाल अब जो आज जो बात करेंगे, इनकी लेटेस्ट किताब है द पुरब। और अफसोस मुझे है कि आलोक राय यहाँ नहीं हैं और शाहिद अमीन यहाँ नहीं हैं, जो पूरब के और पूरबिया कल्चर के बहुत बड़े अलंबरदार रहे हैं। लेकिन यही पूरब वालों का वतीरा है कि वो बतियाते रह जाते हैं और किताब फिरंगी आके लिख जाते हैं। तो प्लीज़ वेलकम फ्रांचेस्का ऑर्सिनी।
माफ़ कीजिए महमूद, मैंने आपको रोकना नहीं चाह रही थी। और मुझे खैर मुझे हिंदी में उतनी उर्दू में बोलने को कहा नहीं गया है, इसलिए मैंने अपना मजमून अंग्रेज़ी में तैयार किया है। तो माफ़ कीजिए अगर बीच बीच में अगर चाहें तो हिंदी में भी बात कर सकती हूँ। तो खैर, thank you very much Mahmood, Baran, thank you Ashok ji for being here for this invitation. I have been unusually nervous about this occasion. I have very fond memories of walking down or driving down with Alok Rai, his cousin Sarah, and her husband Aslam to Faruqi Sahab's home on Hastings Road in Allahabad, guarded by those huge dogs, which he patted very fondly. And I can still picture all of us sitting in his study or sitting room and being regaled with lectures on Sher o Shairi after tea and biscuits or sevain for Eid. And I'm afraid I'm a very prosaic person myself. I don't have an ounce of Shairi in me. And the only poetry I can work with is poetry with a narrative. And occasionally I'd bring him a new book of mine or an essay I thought might interest him. But he never gave me much bhav. I think he appreciated my research. Bahut mehnati hai, he said. But what I worked on, popular publishing, songbooks, baramase, was not to his taste. Nor do I think he approved of my multilingual approach to literary history. Would it perhaps undermine Urdu? So I don't think he'd approve of my book, East of Delhi, and what I'm going to say today, but khair, I mean, I hope he doesn't mind. So 2 questions were in my mind when I was preparing for this talk. One to which I don't know really the answer is to what extent Faruqi Sahab and his family were Purbiya local cosmopolitans. That is, people who valued and identified with Urdu and Persian, but also had access to and enjoyed or strolled, as we will see the term, sair, into other language gardens, like the Bilgranis I'm going to talk about. And the other question is the one he raised in his book, Early Urdu Literary Culture, which is why there is no poetry and prose in the language we call Urdu in North India at all before the 17th century at least. Despite the fact that Khariboli Urdu was the language of Delhi and its environs, and that sources indicate that it was also the common lingua franca of Hindus and Muslims. Why such a long gap? He notes that Sufis were everywhere the first to write in the vernaculars, but Sufis in Purab wrote in Awadhi and elsewhere in North India. He suggested Persian seems to have been understood widely enough to make the emergence of Urdu as a poetic language unnecessary. And I think, and I'll try to argue today, that we can give a somewhat different answer to this question and show what Farsidan poets in North India did when they experimented with the vernacular of Bhaka or Hindi before Rekhta came along. So, the region of Purab, or east of Delhi, so my most recent book is called East of Delhi, formed of the Mughal subas or provinces of Awadh and Allahabad, had no major capital apart from Jaunpur in the 15th century and later Lucknow in the 18th and 17th century. And that was actually one reason why I chose it. I thought that people always talk about Mughal culture and then talk about the culture of the Mughal court. I can. Better? Acha. Okay. Okay. So one attraction of so that there was no capital, there was no imperial court, but it was dotted with small towns or qasbe, where local administrators, teachers, traders, and religious specialists lived and worked. So Daud from Dalmau writes about the fictional town of Govar in the Chandayan. Sorry, I'll come to it in a moment, sorry. Baban, Khatri, Bais, Guvara, Khandarwar or Agarwara, Basahi, Gandhai or Manijara, Jati, Saravgi or Pavara. These are the various caste people who live in this town. Basahi, Tiwari or Pachwana, Dhakar, Joshi or Jagmana. Sorry, I can need my glasses. Thakur, Bahuta, Basahi, Chauhana, Parja, Pauni, Nao, Kojana. And 2 centuries and a half later, Usman writes about the inhabitants of Ghazipur. You'll see how things have changed a bit. Mughal, Pathan, Basahi, Kandhare. Ran Amit, Jinhasah, Sarare. So there are Mughals and Pathan who are great in battle and in hunting and praiseworthy. Puni Rajpur, Basahi, Ranurure, or Gunijan, Samagunapure. Bhat, Kalavand, Basai, Sujana, Jin Pingal, Sangeet, Bakhana. So we see, we already, even if they're not actual descriptions, at least the social imagination that we find in this text is one in which these different groups live. And local histories of Qasbas like Bilgram list the names of the Mohallas, Khatrana, Bhatpura, Miantola, Qazipura, Saidwara, and so on, and convey a sense of their diverse population and activities. So Purab was interesting for me, so to choose it as a place to work on, because it had no court, because it was a region of very early Islamic conquest in the 11th and 12th centuries. And the Qasbas that I focused on were garrisons and trade marts along trade routes that went all the way from Bengal to Delhi and then to Afghanistan or to Agra and south to Gujarat. And what did they trade? Horses, precious stones, slaves, perfumes, fine cloth. And they were also administrative and religious outposts of the North Indian sultanates, and that's why I edited the book on after Timur, because again, everybody starts with the Mughals, but actually before the Mughals, a lot of sort of North Indian literary culture had already been established. So Daud's Chandayan is written in the Sultanate period. And as many of you know, Muslim religious service families receive lands as grants in aid to support themselves and to populate, develop, and control the territory. And just to complete the sort of the, a sort of historical and social sense of this area, from the time of the Sultanates throughout the Mughal period, the qasbas were surrounded by a countryside largely controlled by armed chieftain landlords in their mud forts. Hindu as well as Afghan and Turkic chieftains provided military labor to a succession of rulers, from the sultans to the Mughal and later to the East India Company. Purbiya soldier cultivators, here is an illustration of a later Chandayan manuscript of some of these, what I can imagine, these Purbiya farmer soldiers, fought all the way to Malwa in Gujarat and remained famous until 1857. Muslim rural chieftains, also called Rajas, were ethnically and linguistically diverse: Turk, Afghan, Mughal, and Indian. And while as Hindu chieftains, according to their own narratives, remained largely mobile until the 17th century. In other words, they couldn't have a kind of retained hold over a homeland. And also, unlike the Rajputs further west, Purbiya Rajputs were not co-opted into the Mughal Empire. They didn't become Mansabdars. Though occasionally they served in the Mughal armies, they did not rise in the imperial ranks or become connected to the imperial house. Only in the general increase of wealth in the Mughal Empire were they able to garner enough resources and strength to settle and set up local courts in places like Amethi, Pratapgarh, Asothar, or Dhondia Khera. These are the kind of Hindu sort of Rajware, I suppose, of this area. So despite being at the center, geographically at the center of the empire, power in the region, I would say, remained always contested and never fully centralized. Nor were there powerful local dynasties or military clans incorporated, as I said, in the high level into the Mughal state, as in Rajasthan. And it was perhaps for this reason that Persian, the sort of main language of the Sultanate and Mughal empires, did not become completely hegemonic. From the point of view of modern literary histories, so it may seem paradoxical that it was Sufis who first composed the first literary text in Eastern Hindi, in Awadhi or Purbi, in the late 14th century, and it was sultans, their local notables, or Mughal grantees who first patronized local Brajbhasha poets, like Narhari or Gang in the 16th century. Towns, ahatas, melas, these were spaces for recitation and performance. Again, Daud writes about Govar, Barua Ram Ramayanu Kahi, Gavahi Geet Naach Bhala Karahi. Gavahi Geet O Kahi Pawara, Nat Nachahi or Bajhi Tala. And Jaisi writes about the city of Jais, Mal Bhand Nat Natak Nachahi, Pandit Baithi Sastra Bachahi. Geet Nath Ras Katha, Bhala Ho Visram, Gad ke log bhayo sukhi, Dan dehi bhala dam. So, and for me, this sense of oral access and familiarity, that the Gad ke log sunte hain aur acha daam dete hain, has been important to understand the circulation of songs and stories across languages and communities of taste, Sufis, Bhaktas, Rajas, Praja, traders, sons, even without translation, so that they didn't need the translation in order to have access. And so one of the main questions, in fact, that emerges from in my book is why some poets, like Maluk Das, for example, of Kada, Paltu Das of Ayodhya, Afzal of Bikat Kahani fame, consciously mixed languages, while other bilingual poets, like Ghulam Nabi Raslin, whom we'll see, did not. So, Faruqi yes, and I love this picture from Masnavi Guzari Ram of Mir Hassan that really gives you a sense of, the space in which, you didn't need to read things to have access to songs and tales. You just needed to go through spaces. So Faruqi Saab's family was from Koiriapar village in Azamgarh district. The family was, in Mahmud's words, Sharif rather than Rais. Faruqi Saab's grandfather, Maulvi Muhammad Asghar, was the first in the family to receive a modern education and became a teacher at the normal school in Gorakhpur. About Gorakhpur, the late 18th century encyclopedia Hadiqa al-Aqalim by Murtaza Hussain Bilgrami says, I don't know if you can see Gorakhpur over there, it says it's a middling city, Shahar-e Mutawassat, on the river Ghagra to the north, pleasant. Rice, yellow oil, chicken, and I think charge, as found winnowed corn, are cheap here, and you can get ghulam or kanizak cheaply and easily. About his hometown of Bilgram, Murtaza Hussain wrote that it's a qasba with khush wa abu hawa, and it has a well, a chah. If you drink its water for 4 days, your voice and appearance will improve. By this time, Bilgram had already become a famous qasba, singled out with Awadh, meaning Ayodhya, and Banaras by chroniclers as one of the famous places in the region. Now, how did it become famous? So its fame was arguably a product of the success of its sons, of the Bilgramis, in rising beyond local service. Maybe what actually Faruqi Saab's ancestors were doing was more local service, into imperial networks.
Closer to the mic.
Sorry, it's just that it's very, sorry. क्या करें? आगे करें, इसको पीछे करें.
थोड़ा सा congested हो रहा है ना.
हाँ. कोई बात नहीं. कोई बात. माफ कीजिए.
आप थोड़ा सा. Is it better?
मुझे माइक की बहुत आदत नहीं है इसलिए. Better? अच्छा, thank you. Okay. So the fame of Bilgram was arguably the product of the success of his sons, as I said. As part of their rise, they inscribed their beloved Vatan into cosmopolitan and pious geographies in their tazkiras and celebrated its pool of talents, as you would say. So you don't have to read all these names, but this is just to give you a visual sense of one of these poets' tazkira, Mir Ali Azad Bilgrami, when a lot of people have become interested in, really interesting, although he moved to the Deccan, but still he wrote several tazkiras, one on Sarve Azad, which includes, as you can see, a lot of Bilgrami. So he wrote in the 18th century, and he gave disproportionate. So you can see he starts with actually famous poets like Faizi, like Shamlu, like Khabushani, Noi Khabushani. Then he has more famous contemporaries like Nasir Ali Sirhindi and Bedil. And then, as you can see, from around 114 out of 143, he starts putting a lot of Bilgramis in. Almost all the entries are about Bilgramis. So that's one way of making your town famous. You write an encyclopedic work. You start with the famous ones, and you put all your friends and relatives. I don't think he was the only one to use this strategy. And in fact, and he celebrates his own grandfather, Abdul Jalil Bilgrami, as the one who had catapulted his children and other Bilgramis into imperial service, in fact, in Emperor Aurangzeb's time. And if you want, there's a wonderful article by Abhishek Kaikar on the very varying fortunes of Abdul Jalil Bilgrami and how dangerous it is to write a Masnavi for the king at the wrong time. So education was key to becoming a local cosmopolitan. For the scribal elite, it was social reproduction, and for the rest, it was a step to social mobility. So it's no surprise that teachers, like Mir Taqi Muhammad Bilgrami, are among the Bilgramis that Azad praises in effusive terms, as you can see here, even when, as he says, only once in a while he practiced arranging verses in order to sharpen his nature. So probably he wasn't a regular poet or a particularly good poet. Now, education invariably involved learning one or more languages, either Persian and Arabic, or Sanskrit, or Bhajbasha, or a combination of them. This in turn involved memorizing verses, and again, this is, I think, important for me to sort of bear in mind, that made the poetic rhythms. So typically, if you learn the language, then you would learn literary books. or memorize verses. And so those made the poetic rhythms and repertoire of images and tropes of those languages part of one's body. So in his letters home, Azad's grandfather Abdul Jalil, who had trained in all the sciences and was fluent in Persian, Turki, and Arabic, he had learned the whole Arabic Qamus dictionary by heart, urged his son to study Arabic hard, and was delighted when his son wrote to him that he had been able to cite an Arabic verse at the right moment, extempore. So several writers interestingly distinguish between studying and strolling. About his grandfather, Abdul Jalil Azad wrote that, he had learned all this, he had, ingested the Arabic dictionary, but his lofty status was too high for him to put his lips to the trifling talk of Hindi poetic themes. Lab baturahate shairi esima manzumate Hindi mikashid, and contaminate his muhtat tongue with unnecessary chit-chat. But occasionally, if he sought to cure his jigger when it got too hot, he would listen to Hindi. So, a pastime. And about himself, as you can see, Azad confessed that I am, in fact, he became a big poet and writer in Arabic, as well as, in fact, perhaps more Arabic than Persian. I'm as acquainted with Arabic as with Persian and Hindi languages, and I drink of all the three cups as much as I can. But for Arabic and Persian, I trained in Sukhan for a long time and nourished Parvardam in the bosom of thought, the tender shoots of meaning, Norasani mani, or which can also mean the nine rasas. Though I did not have the opportunity to train in Hindi poetry, Mashke Sukhane Hindi, and I could not conquer the green pastures of this dominion, I had plenty of opportunities to hear the melodies. Again, listening rather than necessarily studying or reading. An ample chance to savor the sugar cellars of this land of flowers. Now, the funny thing is that on the Hindi side, you could say, an author of a courtly, I call it a courtly katha, it's a kind of very reety Prem Katha romance in Awadhi, Puhakar, Rasaratan from 1618, also tell us that he trained to be a professional kayast. He studied Sanskrit authors. He names Valmiki, Kalidasa, Bana, Sriharsha, Devadandi, Bhanudatta, Udayana, and Chand Bardai, also, interestingly, and reflected on prosody and the various poetic forms. Chanda, Vanda, Pingala, Prabhanda, Vahurupa, Vicharana. But he also strolled through Persian poetry and recited Persian verses. Parsiya kavya puni ser vidhi, najman asar avyat kahiya. So, ser, najman, nazma, sar, sher, in abyat, bet, abyat. So, strolling, ser, metaphors of scent, flowers, bees, hearing melodies, savoring the taste of scent of poetry, all suggest, of course, poetic appreciation, but also a less systematic literary training. And in some cases, as we could see with Azad Bilgrami about his grandfather, a kind of a hierarchy between poetic languages. And to come back to my first question, were Faruqi Sahab's ancestors local cosmopolitans who trained in Farsi and at least some Arabic, but also strolled into Hindi in any way? Did they watch and listen to performances of tales and geet or not? I don't know. Now, this leads me to the other questions. Why did Rekhta or Urdu poetry emerge in northern India so late, only in the 18th century? Was it really because Farsi was so widely, if not universally, understood? Azad Bilgrami's Tazkira Sarve Azad, the freestanding Cypress, offers another explanation, I think. It's pretty unique among Persian Tazkiras, which usually deal only with Persian, in that it includes a whole separate chapters on the poets of Bilgram who also wrote in Hindi. And as you can see, the poets of Bilgram who wrote in Hindi who were also Saids or Sheikhs. Actually, there were other poets of Bilgram who wrote in Hindi who are not included in the Tazkira. But in fact, we hear from a local, we learn from a local history, Tarikh-e Bilgram, of Ghasita Rai and Rai Har Prasad, who interestingly were clearly, Alimana and Shairana. And also that he says that they knew thousands of Persian and Arabic verses by heart. So it went from both sides. And in fact, Shivshin Singh Sengar, the writer of the first, you could say, Hindi Tazkira, writes that Harivansh Mishra Bilgrami was in fact the one who taught Hindi poetry to Azad's grandfather, Abdul Jalil. There's really very little mention of him, and they are not it work. You always have to think that something is bound to be excluded, and who is excluded and what is excluded. And I have to also acknowledge my debt to the pioneering scholarship of Dr. Shailesh Zaidi for his work on these Bilgrami poets. Now, what is particularly interesting, and I mean, I find it very interesting, I'm not sure if you will, but actually what you see is that not just you have several poets, Persian, Farsi-done poets of Bilgram who write in Hindi, but that actually you can see a whole range of tastes. So you start with Sheikh Shah Muhammad Farmuli, who was actually an Amir of Islam Shah Suri. The history of Afsane Shahan says that Islam Shah kept himself surrounded by accomplished scholars and poets like Manjan, the author of Madhumalti, Shah Muhammad Farmuli and his younger brother, and other scholars and poets, and poems in Arabic, Persian, and Hindi were recited. So he's a kind of almost like a link to the previous, to the Sultanate period, although Azad mentions him in connection with Akbar. Actually, maybe I can go through to him directly. Farmuli's poetry seems to have been of a kind of popular type. And in fact, it's kind of linked to a local story about his love for the quick-tongued local girl Champa. Farmuli on horseback notices her wearing a black thread around her arm. He pointed at the ornament, this is Azad telling us, and says, "How pretty, it's a bhawar sitting on a lotus." And for his Persian readers, Azad explains that the bhawar is what they call a black bee, and the kawal is a nilufar. He compared the black silk to the black bee and the arm to a red lotus, which is commonly used in Hindi Mauzunan metrical poetry, and the love, ishq, of the black bee for the lotus is established among the connoisseurs of Hindi, like the nightingale for the rose in Persian. And with flowery language, Champa answered, "It's not a bhawar, it's a gobarband, a black bee that comes out of cow dung." So Champa boldly corrects and cheekily corrects Shah Farmuli, who may perhaps be hinting that he himself is a bhawara, I don't know. She suggests an even more earthy insect, or perhaps insults him, and a more precise word. Impressed, Shah Farmuli carries Champa off, and they live happily together, engaging in poetic repartees. And here is one verse that incorporates Champa's name, which can also be read as flower-like, lamp, or light. Man patanga phiri phiri pare, champa rupa tuvajoti, ratana deep mukh jagmagay, pooki marahi sat soti. Round and round your light it flitters, my heart, Champa, a moth. Your face like gem glitters, like a wicked wife, my heart puffs up in smoke. Next comes Said Nizamuddin Madonayak, who shows the connection that, people like Nalini Delvoye or scholars like Nalini Delvoye or Catherine Schofield have shown between Persian connoisseurs and Brajbasha for the sake of music. So again, Azad tells us that after he became proficient in Persian verse and prose at a young age and even clearly was a teacher, Madonayak turned to Hindi knowledge, ilme Hindi, and in the city of Benares, which is the foundation of Rasa, he studied the books of Sanskrit and Bhaka, so general term for Hindi or Brajbasha, and acquired great skill. He acquired knowledge of Naad and Tal, so sound and rhythm in Indian music, and played Sangeet uniquely well. So he became a scholar. He, in fact, took Madonayak as a takhallus. He wrote 2 books, and the experts, sort of took him as an expert, and his compositions are famous, and singers touch their ears when they mention their name. And actually, Madonayak is also mentioned by Murtaza Hussain Bilgrami, who, if you remember, wrote that one thing Bilgram was famous for was a well whose water makes one's voice melodious. So he mentions Madonayak in connection to that. Other entries, of it's not here in this list, Mir Abdul Bahil Bilgrami and Said Barkatullah, who's sort of famous as a Sufi in Marehra, show instead the continuous currency, again, interestingly, of Hindavi songs and poetry in Sufi practice. As Mahmoud said, one of the Bilgramis wrote this Risala Haqaiq Hindi, which glossed all the words in Hindi songs, including words connected with Krishna, Yashoda, and so on, for Persian Sufi adepts, showing thus that they listened to those songs often and carefully, but drew out their own meaning. And his great-grandson, Barkatullah, whose Farsi and Hindi takhallus mirror each other, Premi and Ishqi, wrote a whole work called Prem Pragasa, The Light of Love, which starts out as a Masnavi or a Prem Katha, but is not narrative, and instead it's sort of collection of sayings and instructions and so on. And finally, Ghulam Ali Muhib Raslin, who represents the pinnacle of sophistication in Brajbhasha courtly poetic culture. He was a military man who died fighting the Rohillas in the service of the second Nawab of Awadh, Safdar Jang. And Raslin is the most famous Qasba bilingual Persian and Brajbhasha poet. He's the author of a well-regarded manual of poetics, the Ras Prabodh. And as you can see, Azad on the left wrote that it was predicted by birth that he would become a poet. He was well-versed in Arabic, Persian, and Hindi arts. He studied with Mir Tufel Muhammad Bilgrami, especially in his Hindi verse. He reached unparalleled heights. And we can see sort of confirmation in this in one of the first, you could say, canonization of Hindi poetry, but his contemporary and close by, neighbor Bhikhari Das, who was perhaps the most famous scholar of Brajbhasha poetics of the time, who interestingly includes both Raslin and Mubarak from Bilgram in the earliest example, as I say, of canonization of Brajbhasha poets in his Kavya Nirnaya. So you can see there in the third line, Alam Rahim Raslin Mubarak Anekana Sumati Bhaye Kahan lo Bakhaniye. So they have of good mind, Sumati, these are the best poets of Brajbhasha. And then he says, Brijbhasha het, Brijbhas hi na anumano. So you don't have to be resident of Braj to be a Brajbhasha poet. Aise aise kabin ki bani hu, so janiye. Know them from there. The language and poetic works have been, varied, and such wonderful poets have existed. At the end, and you can see that, this is one example of his, of Raslin's, kabita mutafarriq, so sort of stray kabita, which is a praise of Ganga. So he can do that. He can do a praise of Ganga in sort of pure Brajbhasha terms. Vishnu ju ke pagte nikasa sabusis basi bhagirat tapte kripa kari jahan pe. So he can do that. But he can also do, at the end of the section of Azad's selection of Raslin Hindi verses, Azad Bilgrami specifically quotes two descriptions of the heroine in the Rekhta language and the Wazan of a Rubai, so quatrain AABA. The first reads, and it's this one, Sakia or Swakia. As bas ke haya dost hai, wo maya naz. And here you feel, okay, this is more, we are coming towards it. We are coming towards Urdu. As bas ke haya dost hai, wo maya naz. Is tarah so hai, iske sukhan ka andaz. Khame ki zaban so jo nikalte hain huruf, par kan talak nahi pahunchti awaz. So, here we find the kind of experimental accommodation that Heidi Powers found in the Kishanga poet Prince Nagridas. So the grammar is largely Khariboli, it's not Brajbhasha. Is tarah so hai, iske sukhan ka andaz. You have very few Persian compounds and Izafat forms, haya dost, maya naz. But the vocabulary is much more Persianite than in Raslin's other Brajbhasha poems. And yet this Persianate vocabulary here is matched to the emotional and poetic language of the Naika Bhed, the catalogue of heroines in Brajbhasha. Here the overtly timid wife who speaks but her voice doesn't reach the ears, rather than the Ashik and Mashuk. So 2 Rekhta poems are not a lot. Raslin, who also wrote poetry in Persian, seems to have remained a solidly bilingual Persian and Brajbhasha poet, and have consciously kept the 2 idioms separate. He did Brajbhasha or Persian. And indeed, this was one of the options or the choices that bilingual poets had. He also probably died too young in 1750 to be part of the expansion of Rekhta poetry into Awadh in Purab with the consolidation of the Nawabi and the migration of poets from Delhi. So what happened? So then if we come to Urdu from this perspective, what happened to this parallel cultivation of Persian and Hindavi, or Hindavi meaning Hindavi, Brajbhasha or Awadhi, when the taste for Rekhta or Urdu poetry swept over North India in the 18th century? Now, single language approaches tend to view change as substitution. So first there was Persian, then there was Urdu. A multilingual approach instead notes the new fashions, often rearrange rather than supersede old tastes. So as I said, while a single language approach reads the likes of Urdu poetry as a switch from Farsi to Urdu, a multilingual approach reads it rather as a shift and an adjustment within a literary culture that remained multilingual. So in very broad terms, what we see, I think, is a bifurcation. If you wait for a minute there. So a bifurcation between urban Lucknow and Qasbai and rural Awadh. In rural Awadh and the Qasbas, the old Persian Brajbhasha or Brajbhasha-only poetic culture persisted even when in Lucknow literary culture became identified with Persian and particularly Urdu. So in what happens in Lucknow, that a few patrons and poets, so typically ministers of the Nawabs, Atmaram, Tikait Rai seems to have been a big patron of Brajbhasha poets, and a few Brajbhasha books still continue to be written. But Brajbhasha remained on a much more limited scale. The taste for Brajbhasha really shrank to the domain of music and songs. So Lucknow poetic culture, in fact, made space for demotic worlds and words within the dialogues of Masnavis, the emotional laments of Marsiyas, and the incipient urban theater, if you think of Indra Sabha or Wajid Ali Shah's own Rahas. So this interest in music and song, of course, still required some familiarity with Brajbhasha aesthetics and poetic repertoire. If anybody has read or watched or listened to the Indra Sabha, most of the song, you've got ghazals, but you've got a lot of Hori and Kajri and other, sort of Brajbhasha songs in Brajbhasha, and a few that actually mix Urdu and Brajbhasha. So you still needed some familiarity, but less intensive study. Otherwise, in Lucknow, Persian-Urdu bilingualism really seems to have replaced the olden Persian Awadhi or Brajbhasha bilingualism. And in fact, the Hindi Brajbhasha poetic past was quickly forgotten. And if you look at Urdu poetic taskiras, they do not mention Urdu poets also writing in Brajbhasha. So I don't know if they did and they don't mention, but they didn't consider it important enough to mention. By contrast, in the courts of Pratapgarh and so on, the towns of Awadh, as well as in nearby Banaras, and actually it's quite interesting to think of Lucknow and Banaras in parallel rather than as representing two different literary cultures. But anyway, by contrast, in nearby Banaras, Brajbhasha poetry remained invoked well into the 20th century at the Maharaja's court and in urban merchant-led circles, just think of Bhartendu Harishchandra. But despite these differences, and there was a little bit of Persian, in fact, even at the Maharaja's court, some of the employees of his East India Company, some old Banaras Sharif families, and we know that even Bhartendu, tried to do some Urdu poetry. So it's not that it's only Brajbhasha. There's some Persian and Urdu in Banaras as well. So despite these differences, the multilingual approach then can highlight the commonalities between the courtly and public culture in Lucknow and Benares in the 19th century, where I think one of the most important genres was the song in both cities. And also it alerts us to continuities in multilingual education, tastes, and poetic practices despite the real and epistemic shift with colonialism. So in fact, it's interesting that if you read Persian Tazkira of Benares of the early 19th century, a lot of the Persian poets mentioned there are Norasan. They've just come into Benares after it's come under East India Company control. So to conclude, the lack of centralization and the Qasba rural dynamics make Purab an ideal standpoint to observe how literature works on the ground in a multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, unlike imperial or other courts, where the elite courtly culture becomes synonymous with culture at large. So what Akbar likes or what Shah Jahan likes becomes culture. Today, because of Faruqi Sahab, I focus on Farsidan Qasba literati, their multilingual education and range of tastes. In my book, East of Delhi, I also explore Sun poets like Maluk Das, the Sufi poets of Awadhi Prem Kathas or romances, and the circulations of Prem Kathas across languages and communities of taste. So for me, the literary history of Purab needs to be told as a story of several parallel and overlapping processes. So rather than taking languages as your subject, you think of space and you think of people. What did people know? What did they have study? But also where did they stroll? What did they have access to? Whether they mention it or not. And as you can see, then it's in effect, we know about some parts better than others. I'm still looking for, how did Sanskrit transmission continue to happen so that when Brajbhasha poetry becomes a thing, you have all these Sanskrit-trained poets who can do their Naika Bhed, and they can clearly know Sanskrit like Puhakar. But there's less work being done on Sanskrit, Sanskrit training and culture outside the court or outside the city of Benares, for example. So in the book, I approach the emergence and consolidation of both Hindi and Urdu as two separate languages from this earlier perspective. And if I want, I can answer questions about it. So to come back to my two questions. Faruqi Sahab was completely invested in Urdu and Persian and was very well versed in Hindi literature and literary theory as well, of course. I don't know what other tastes his ancestors had, but I would really be curious to know if they also listened to Hindi or Hindavi songs, Purbi Awadhi romances, or cultivated Brajbhasha poets like the Bilgramis I've talked about today. And if Faruqi Sahab, like the child at the beginning of Intezar Hussein's novel Basti, also listened to the creation story of Brahma and Sheshnag from a Bhagaji, along with his grandfather Abbajan's story of Mount Qaf and his grandmother's story of the tears of Mother Hawa. Was he like that, or were they like that in the family? I don't know. As for the second question, before Rekhta or Urdu poetry took Delhi and Awadh by storm, and really you don't see it in Awadh before 1750, which is really interesting because then Lucknow becomes the Garh of Urdu, but really there's no Urdu in Lucknow before 1750, which is an interesting, but for me, absolutely understandable. It's fashion, that becomes fashion, and that's what you do. And it's a very, of course, powerful and endlessly fascinating poetry with which you can do so much. So, as to the second question, my answer would be that not just Sufi, but generally Farsidan, who also wanted to compose in Bhaka, did so in one of the varieties and poetic genres of Hindavi. As I said, either Awadhi Kathas in Chopai Dohe, mixed Sadukari type, mixed language Dohe, Brajbhasha, more Riti kind Dohe and Kabit. And when Rekhta poetry came along, they switched. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Ashok Ji for his comments as a chair.
Friends, I think I'm the most inappropriate person to preside over this lecture. I lack the academic rigor. I also lack the academic knowledge. and the capacity to analyze. But what I understood is that how poetry and the social fabric were very closely and organically related to whatever happened. But I leave it at that, except that I recall my own early years. I was born of a father who had migrated from Uttar Pradesh to Madhya Pradesh. But I was born in Madhya Pradesh. And we had Bundelkhandi as the local language. But since my father had come from UP, which was called Desh, we were not allowed to speak or learn Bundelkhandi. हम तो देश के लोग हैं. So I did not learn Bundelkhandi, but I also did not learn Awadhi. And later, my first posting in the civil service was in Chhattisgarh. So I'll give you 3 sentences which I remember from these 3 languages. In Bundelkhandi, when I was studying in Delhi, I was going home in a railway which moved almost with the speed of a balgadi. You know, it was so slow from Bina to Sagar. And a group of farmers sat on the floor, although there were benches in the compartment. And when we reached a station, it was raining and the sun was also rising. So वो जो बूंदें थी वो चमक रही थी, जैसे उनमें एक सुनहरी चमक थी. तो एक किसान ने दूसरे से कहा, बुंदेलखंडी में कहा, देखो कैसो चमकदार बरस रहो, चमकदार बरस रहो. I went to Sagar and we had a Bundelkhandi expert there, and I said, have you ever heard this word, chamaktar? He said, no such word exists. So I saw a farmer coin a word. So I wrote a poem using that word. And the Banaras, which was mentioned, it was composed in Banaras, the press, and he thought, chamaktar? This fellow doesn't know enough Hindi, so he made it chamakdar. So the whole damn thing was lost. The second was, when I was very young, my Upanayan Sanskar took place in my village in Baiswada, part of Awadh. And there, my grandmother was perhaps a very stingy person. She had invited the whole village, but there were not enough masalas, the spices. So the lady who was in charge of the spices came, and he said, "Ee pav bhar jeere mein ka baram bhoj hoi." So this was the second I remember. And the third is when I was, we have to be hold court and listen to all kinds of things before getting judicial powers or whatever. So there was an old lady, and there was a advocate in Mahasamund arguing in wrong English, of course, and the lady was about to lose. But somehow I looked at the old woman and I said, कि आपको भी कुछ कहना है? तो खड़ी हुई, well, labari maris Maharaj. Labari maris Maharaj. Labar is the जो झूठ बोलता है. ये वैसे आजकल हमारे प्रधानमंत्री के बारे में कहा जा सकता है. अगर वो बुढ़िया होती तो जरूर कहती लबारी मारिस महाराज. तो बहरहाल, so I remember these 3, but I'll not dilate more upon it. I want to read 3 short translations that Faruqi Sahab had done. Faruqi Sahab was an incredible phenomenon. He wrote, which I consider perhaps the best novel in the last 25 years. Sare Asma. And he wrote the most fantastic critical book in 4 volumes, I think, on Mir. Incidentally, Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh का भी एक एग्जीबिशन हुआ था जिसका टाइटल था कारवां. और उन्हीं दिनों मीर की सारी कविताएं हिंदी में पहली बार पूरी छपी. तो मैं उसको पलट रहा था, मुझे उसमें एक शेर मिल गया. अब पहला मिसरा तो मुझे याद नहीं है, आलम के साथ क्यों न जाएं हम मीर, ऐसा कुछ है। आलम तमाम, आलम तो कारवां है और हम कारवानियाँ। लुक एट द कॉइनेज दैट ही हैज डन। आलम तो कारवान है, हम कारवानियाँ। बहरहाल, the only text, no, not this. Be content and live happy, for it's only a week away. For me, the future when you will be past. And the Khayyam, the mysteries of eternity without beginning. You know not, nor do I. The text of this riddle you read not, nor do I. All our exchanges of I and you are from behind a veil. When the veil is lifted, you are not, nor am I.
Wow.
So, there was another one which I seem to have lost. Anyway. So, friends, what we have heard is that, and the facts and the which we brought to our notice are really not part of our academic analysis, etc. The remarkable thing about our Hindi-Urdu academics is that whatever may be the new discoveries, and we may be aware of them, we never make use of them to amend our views or to expand our analysis. We acknowledge that this is very good work being done. I recently have acquired a series of books run by non-Indian scholars on various aspects of, and they all are telling you how wrong your impressions about Hindi, Urdu literature, literary heritage, etc. But no asar usko zara nahi hota. And I have also been wondering, how is it कि हिंदी पे जो काम हुआ है वो ज़्यादातर विदुषियों ने किया है, ये ससुरे मर्द क्यों नहीं कर पाए? I mean, मतलब she is one of the best scholars we have. उसके पहले इटली से Mariola Afridi, and there are several others. Which are all women. And it's surprising that they have penetrated into this rather masculine, well-protected world. There are very few women yet you cited, no? And yet our own scholars have not been able to do it. So thank you very much. This would be one of the best tributes to Shamsur Rahman Faruqi, who combined in himself a great amount of creativity, but also very deep scholarship, a rare combination in India, in any case, or perhaps elsewhere. Thank you very much.
बहुत शुक्रिया अशोक जी। ये किताब से अशोक जी ने 2-3 आपको नज़में सुनाई तर्जुमा। मैं चाहूँगा कि हमारे डिस्पर्स होने से पहले 12 हमको फ़ारसी का भी थोड़ा उसका जायका दे दें, तो फ़ारसी ओरिजिनल और ट्रांसलेशन साथ में हम सुने, फिर हम इस शाम को इख्तिताम की तरफ ले चलें।
तो पहले ये बताओ यहाँ फ़ारसी जानने वाले कितने लोग हैं ताकि आई कैन गेट अवे विद यू नो अ फ्यू मिस्टेक्स। नहीं, महफूज तो खैर हमारे कैंप में रहेंगे मेरे ख्याल से, कुछ ही विल नॉट गिव आउट द लेट आउट द कैट ऑफ द बैग। अच्छा, एक दो जो हमने मार्क किए हैं अभी पढ़ के सुना देते हैं। फ़ारसी भी पढ़ने की कोशिश करेंगे। आज़ाद बिलग्रामी का एक मुझे बहुत पसंद है। ज़दा अम्बर सरे जहाँ पापोश, ज़दा अम्बर सरे जहाँ पापोश, बेसबब ई बरहना पाई नीस्त। My sandals I have thrown at the world's face. My sandals I have thrown at the world's face, not without reason do I walk barefooted. Not आपने चुना था ये,
लेकिन खो गया। जी, हमें लग रहा था शायद ये वाला हो। बहुत ही अच्छा लगता है ये। क्या बात है। यगाना बूदन और यक्ता शुदन जे चश्मामोज, यगाना बूदन और यक्ता शुदन जे चश्मामोज, कि हर दो चश्म जुदा और जुदा नमी निगरद। Learn from the eyes how to be the same and different. Learn from the eyes how to be the two are apart and yet they see eye to eye. ये है मनोहर, मनोहर है शायर का नाम। फिर रूमी का एक पढ़ते हैं। हासिले उम्रम से सुखन बेश नीस्त, हासिले उम्रम से सुखन बेश नीस्त, से माने तीन, खाम बदम पुख्ता शुदम सोख्तम, बुदम, अच्छा, खाम बुदम पुख्ता शुदम सोख्तम। The sum of my life is not more than 3 words. The sum of my life is not more than 3 words. Green, seasoned, burned. I really love this one, huh? Green, seasoned, burned. न्याज़ारम खुद हरगिज़ वेरा, या वेरा है मतलब ये महफूज बता पाएंगे। गे मी तरसम दरू जाई तू बाशद, आई डू नॉट नोइंगली हर्ट एनी वंस हार्ट, नज़ीरी का है। आई डू नॉट नोइंगली हर्ट एनी वंस हार्ट, फॉर हु नोज यू मे हैव अ प्लेस देयर। आई डू नॉट नोइंगली हर्ट एनी वंस हार्ट, for who knows you may have a place there. शेर फिर से पढ़ूँ? अच्छा, न्याज़ारम ज़े खुद हरगिज़ वेरा, न्याज़ारम ज़े खुद हरगिज़ वेरा, गहमी तरसम दरू जाई तू बाशद, क्योंकि मैं डरता हूँ कि कहीं उसके दिल में तुम्हारे लिए जगह ना हो, इसलिए मैं किसी का दिल। लेकिन अब ट्रांसलेशन तो बहुत ही तो हम कभी कभी, हमने एक बार कहा अपने अब्बा से कि आपने तो ओरिजिनल से भी ज़्यादा अच्छा कह रहे, ये मत कहना, ये बहुत ख़राब बात है। ऐसा नहीं कहा जाता है कि ट्रांसलेशन से भी अच्छा, अरे ओरिजिनल से अच्छा ट्रांसलेशन है, इसको मैं अच्छा नहीं समझता। एक पढ़ रहे हैं, साहिब राम खामोश का है। बपीरी मकुन तु बअज़ इश्क़ खूबा, बपीरी मकुन तु बअज़ इश्क़ खूबा, गे आतिशे भारस्त बर्ग खिज़ारा, आतिशे बहारस्त बर्ग खिज़ारा। Do not give up loving the lovely ones even when you are old. Do not give up loving the lovely ones even when you are old, for fire is spring to the yellow leaf. For fire is spring to the yellow leaf. ये साहिब राम खामोश का है। खुसरो का एक पढ़ रही हूँ। ज़े हिजरम चे पुरसी के यारब मबाद, ज़े हिजरम चे पुरसी के यारब मबाद, ज़े सब्रत चे गोयम से हरगिज़ नबूद, हरगिज़ नबूद। Don't ask about the days of separation. Don't ask about the days of separation. God, may they never be. And what can I tell you about patience? I had none. खुसरो का है ये। और मेरे ख्याल से एक और पढ़ देती हूँ। अज़ शर्म बसूए मन नमी दीद, अज़ शर्म बसूए मन नमी दीद, शायद अज़ दर्द मन खबरदाश्त। Out of shame she didn't cast a glance at me. Out of shame she didn't cast a glance at me. Perhaps she had word of my aching heart. This is Raja Ratan Singh Zakhmi. So that's it for you. Thank you.
लवली, बहुत शुक्रिया। इस मैं चाहता था इस किताब का जायका आप लोगों को मिल जाए। इज़ रेचल हियर नाउ? Lovely, thank you very much. This is Rachel from Penguin. She was instrumental in getting this book out in record time. So 3 cheers for you and for Penguin Books and Premanku and everyone who's there. And इजहार आलम साहब यहाँ तशरीफ़ रखते हैं, अर्शिया पब्लिकेशंस के। इजहार आलम साहब हैं, बाहर हैं या चले गए या तशरीफ़ लाइए। इजहार साहब, इन्होंने बड़े अब्बू की ये किताब जो है अभी हाल में छापी है, और उनकी और कुछ किताबें पहले छापी थी दास्तान अबी रमज़ा की, और MR पब्लिकेशन से अब्दुल समद साहब हैं, इन्होंने बड़े अब्बू की बहुत सारी, फ़ारूक़ी साहब की बहुत सी चीज़ें छापी हैं, तो आप लोगों का भी बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। ये किताब दरअसल जो है ना, ये जो 700 तफसीर बालू अपी ने जिक्र किया, एक्चुअली एक कंसाइज हिस्ट्री ऑफ उर्दू लिटरेचर, क्योंकि इसमें आपको मुनीर नियाज़ी से लेके, अहमद मुश्ताक से लेके, ज़फ़र इक़बाल से लेके, आज के जो शायर हैं नासिर काज़मी, आज के शायर जो भी होंगे नासिर काज़मी वग़ैरह, उन सब के बारे में आपको जो सबसे हमारे बाकमाल और सबसे ज़हीन जो हमारा नक्काद था उसकी राय मिल जाती है। तो एक तरह से ये आपको पूरा अहाता करती है, और ये बहुत ही दिलचस्प किताब है, बहुत ही अहम किताब है, और इसको हम आगे और ज़बानों में इंशाल्लाह करने की कोशिश करेंगे। आपका बहुत शुक्रिया अब्दुल समद साहब और इज़हार आलम साहब, और अगले साल हम फिर इज़हार नदीम साहब, इज़हार आलम मैंने आपका नाम क्यों सेव कर रखा? अच्छा, हमारे अनुषा के मामू थे इज़हार आलम, इसलिए मैंने शायद, तो इज़हार के बाद आलम लग ही जाता है मेरी ज़बान से। तो इज़हार, बहुत शुक्रिया इज़हार नदीम साहब। तो अगले साल हम फिर मिलेंगे साथियों। इंडिया हैबिटेट सेंटर का बहुत शुक्रिया, बहुत शुक्रिया किताब के पब्लिशर्स का, अब्दुल समद साहब का, अशोक जी का, फ्रेंचेस्का आपका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। इन्होंने जो बातें कही हैं, अशोक जी ने जैसा कहा, उम्मीद है उर्दू हिंदी वाले इन्हें साथ में लेंगे, वरना वो कहेंगे, वो कहते हैं कहा करें लंदन में, हमको क्या करना, हम तो यहाँ बैठे हैं। तो और आप सब लोगों का बहुत शुक्रिया। अगले साल हम फिर जमा होंगे, और उम्मीद है कुछ और किताबें जो फ़ारूक़ी साहब की हैं पाइपलाइन में हैं, उनको हम दोबारा छाप के अगले साल इस लेक्चर में किसी बहुत दिलचस्प मुकर्रर को लेके किसी और मौजू पे जो फ़ारूक़ी साहब से ताल्लुक़ रखता है आपके सामने हाज़िर होंगे। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया हाज़िर।